Well, welcome back to the Pressing On podcast. I'm your host, Richie Reeder, and today we have a special guest, Rick Lofgren from the Children's Organ Transplant Association with me. Rick is a good friend and looking forward to learning from him and his journey as a leader serving transplant families at COTA. And just a reminder for our listeners that our mission at Pressing On is to uplift, resource, and coach families in crisis, specifically hospitalized families that are going through long-term critical illnesses and also those on the transplant journey. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But you can learn more about our program's impact and story at pressingon.org. Our special guest today is Rick Lofgren. Rick is the president and CEO of the Children's Organ Transplant Association. Founded in 1986, COTA has helped raise more than $160 million for transplant-related expenses and seen over 3,000 COTA patients transplanted successfully. Such an awesome number. Having led COTA since 1998, Rick's specific duties include oversight of major planned giving programs, leading staff management, and the board of directors' growth and development. Under Rick's tenure, COTA's annual revenues have increased from less than $1.5 million to over $10 million. An impressive stat right there. Personally, Rick has a bachelor's degree from Spring Arbor University and an MBA from the University of Illinois at Springfield and a Master of Science in Administration from Central Michigan University. Rick and his wife, Lisa, have 2 married children and 3 grandkids. They are avid cyclists and gardeners as well. So, Rick, welcome to the Pressing On podcast.
Thanks, Richie. It's great to be here with you.
We really appreciate you coming on today because I think that you have a lot to offer, not only in leadership, but also in perseverance, because you've seen so many transplant families persevere throughout the years, and we look forward to drawing on your wisdom in leading this organization for such a long time. And so let's begin with just getting to know you personally. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, your educational experiences, and maybe how you met your spouse, Lisa.
All right. Well, I have a very boring origin story. I was born after my mom and dad graduated from college in Rochester, New York, and my dad was a Free Methodist pastor. So we bumped around. My dad was the pastor that when something went wrong at a church, they would pull the pastor out, put my dad in for a year or two to fix things, and then move them on to the next problem church. So I lived in a number of different parsonages growing up, and by the time I went to college, I had lived in 14 different places. So we moved around quite a bit, and I always joke that I learned to be outgoing because I had to stand at the back of the sanctuary after church and shake everyone's hand and walk by my dad. So that's where I grew up. I met my wife at Spring Arbor our freshman year. I joke that she was dating one of the other guys on the floor, and I swooped in and picked her up after they broke things off. But we were married just a couple of years later, and we put each other through college, put ourselves through graduate school as well. Our kids were born when we were at Spring Arbor, and that, even though we haven't lived there for close to 25 years, we still consider that kind of our second home.
Wow, that's awesome. I mean, sometimes pastors' kids get a bad rap, but clearly you're a great example that they can turn out okay as well. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with Lisa. I mean, we mentioned in the bio that you guys, are cyclists and gardeners, but what does life look like for you when you have maybe a little bit of downtime these days?
Well, as you can tell by the pictures over my shoulder, we are avid cyclists. Lisa and I have a tandem. We also have solo bikes. And my formula, Richie, is always N+1, with N being the number of bikes that you currently own and 1 being the next one that you need to own. So that has been our operating theory. We live out in the country, and so we have opportunity to ride. And I know you and Reagan spend a lot of time in Michigan. We've ridden in Michigan many, many places, and crossed the Mackinac Bridge in a van, but went over to Mackinac Island, rode on the island. Just some incredible experience doing that. But it's nice to get out with your spouse and have some away time where the phones don't ring, the cell phone is just kind of left behind, and you get some one-on-one time with your spouse.
Yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned Mackinac Island, and like you said, we've spent a lot of time in Michigan. Out of any of the places that you've gone cycling over the years, do you have a favorite trail or a favorite place that you've ridden that's like, yeah, that's number one in my book?
Yeah, there are two that I would say are really strong. For Michigan, the Calhaven Trail, which goes from
Okay.
Grand Haven to Kalamazoo. It's about 35 miles. It's wonderful. And then the Leelanau Trail in Traverse City is just fantastic. It goes right along Traverse Bay, and it is just a beautiful spot. A little hillier there than in Kalamazoo, but it just is a fun way to go and a relaxing day. We try to do a week or two at a time and get out every day and ride, and then kayak when we're on vacation too.
I
Absolutely.
want to remind our listeners that this podcast is sponsored by the Children's Organ Transplant Association. I have a big, long commercial that I typically read from, but their president and CEO is right here with us today. So I'll fill that in as time goes on. But we are really, really grateful to have Rick Lofgren, not only as a personal friend, but sponsoring the podcast with COTA. And COTA helps children and young adults who need a life-saving transplant by providing fundraising assistance and family support. They're definitely the trusted leader in supporting transplant families financially for a lifetime. And I know that a lot of the families that we serve at Pressing On have been impacted by COTA, and a lot of the families that we meet on a regular basis, we tell about the great things that COTA can do for them in their fundraising experience for their child's transplant. Let's talk about your initial involvement with COTA. What initially drew you towards the opportunity to lead this organization over 2 decades ago?
Well, I was connected to COTA by a gentleman who had been the previous president of the hospital where we're based in Bloomington, Indiana. When the president of COTA resigned, Bud Core stepped in and did a search and located me, thanks to my dad. My dad was a fundraiser for a hospital in Indianapolis, and he was not interested in the job because he was about to retire, but he forwarded my name and credentials on to Mr. Core. And a couple of months later, went through the interview process and started. But what really drew me to COTA was I had a cousin that had a bone marrow transplant at UCLA back in the mid 70s when it was just a
Hmm.
or cutting edge at that point. And the type of leukemia that Billy had a 3% survival rate. Today, that survival rate is 97%. So it's completely turned around.
Wow. Wow.
Also had several friends that have had transplants. The hospital that I was working at, Richie, at the time in Michigan, one of our board members' sons had multiple leukemia diagnoses, and we did a bone marrow
Hmm.
registration drive. He had a transplant and is doing very well. But it kind of opened my eyes to that part of the transplant world. And so when I got the call for this job, I thought, this is something I feel good about. It will impact my family's life. It is part of our heritage, and it was fun to just be part of something that I knew was bigger than me, and it just has grown. I don't think I could have ever imagined when I started in 1998 that I would be here 25 plus years later.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. Like I was saying before we hit record on the podcast, that your leadership role in this organization, not too many people can say that they've been the president and CEO and led an organization for this long. And so I'm curious because, I mean, I'll share a little bit, in, a few minutes about our family's experience with COTA, because it's been very influential within the Reader family and my daughter Micah's life with her liver transplant. But I think that nobody signs up to be part of the transplant community. It's kind of a tribe that you fall into. But then once you find yourself there, you find all of these amazing families that are persevering together, all of these amazing partners and nonprofits and organizations that are right there by your side. Maybe pull the curtain back on the Children's Organ Transplant Association, for us a little bit. Let us know, as listeners, what the COTA team is like, how they function, how they serve together, how they interact with transplant families.
I look at it, Richie, as that we're part of each of our families' inner circle. We get involved with our families to the point where we talk to our parents. We have regular conversations. There are text exchanges that go on, much like you and Reagan do with Pressing On.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an 8 to 5 job. There are a
Right.
lot of activities that happen in the evening, on weekends, and we want the families that we're working with to know that we're pulling on the oars just as hard as they are. And so our hope is that every one of our staff members is able to provide that level of service that you don't feel like you're contacting an organization, you're contacting a friend. And so our
Mm-hmm.
hope is that every one of our patients, their family members feel that. Um, Give you a good example. We have a family that's based in Mesa, Arizona, and their son had a liver transplant at UCLA. when this little boy was 2 years old. Ben is now 33. He's now a dad himself, has a little daughter that's about a year old. But we got to know their family 25 years ago at an event where we were asked to bring some families to Washington, D.C. to talk about transplantation and to uh, try to influence some things that were going on at that time at the national level so that transplant families had greater resources and maybe a little more say in the care for their kids. That was very successful, but I got to know Ben's family, and his mom and dad and I get together every time I get out to Phoenix. There's a golf
Mm,
outing that was started because of Ben. And now in April of this year, we'll have the 32nd annual event where the funding from that golf outing will help our Arizona families.
mm,
So we really look at this as it is, as you said earlier, it's a lifetime of support, and transplant
mhm,
is not a sprint. It is a journey. And once you get to the destination that you think as a parent that you wanted to get to, you realize that's just the first step of many different phases of your child's life. So our hope
mhm,
is that we walk hand in hand with your families and make sure that any stage of that process, they can reach out to us for help. And as your kids get older and become
mhm.
adults themselves, that we're still going to be there to help them then.
Yeah, it's always awesome to feel like people that were part of your initial support system during the transplant journey have become trusted guides and friends over time. And I know my wife Reagan and I don't take that for granted with all the great folks like yourself that we've met at COTA and other like-minded organizations. I'm curious, you mentioned your relationship with Ben and his family, and obviously CODA's served over 3,000 families that have had successful transplant. When you think about that word perseverance, like what are some of the key characteristics that you've seen in the families that CODA serves, keeping in mind our listening audience that many times is families that are affected by long-term hospitalizations and are on the transplant journey themselves? What are maybe some of the key facets of perseverance that you see in the families you serve?
Well, I look at what we do in our relationship with our families as kind of like a marriage. And in any marriage, you're making deposits, you're making withdrawals, and just like a bank account, there are things that you have to do to keep the marriage healthy, things that we have to do to keep the relationship healthy. And so, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that our families need to be willing to maybe give up a little control that they're not quite sure they want to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I can tell you that one of the things I tell families when I call them, and I talk to literally every one of our parents as we start this process, I tell them, you don't know what you don't know yet. And we have
Mm-hmm.
been doing this for a long time. You mentioned earlier, Richard, we've helped 3,000 families be successful transplanted. We've actually helped more than 4,000 in total. And a lot of those families
Wow.
are still waiting for that life saving transplant. So I know from 25 years of doing this what families don't yet know it's ahead of them. And one of
Mm-hmm.
those things is you've got to focus on your family, you have to focus on your marriage, you have to focus on your other kids so that you get everybody through this successfully.
Yeah.
So it's hard to let go and to give up that control, but there are going to be people that will ask to help and in a positive way take advantage of
Mm-hmm.
their suggestion that they can do something, whether that's getting you to an event, taking care of your dog, bringing you a meal, lots of things that people can help. And maybe it's something very little today, but you get multiple people that are doing something small, and all of a sudden it adds up to a huge
Mm-hmm.
benefit for your family.
That suggestion of the willingness to, you know, give up some sort of control is a good one because I remember feeling that deeply as a father. I know a lot of our listeners are familiar with our daughter Micah Joy's story and her life-saving liver transplant that she received in 2017. And when she was born in 2015, just 9 years and a few days ago, actually, at the end of January, it was at this point in time, exactly 9 years ago, that we were in the hospital trying to figure out exactly what was going on. And, that led to us, having lots of serious sit down talks with the social workers of different resources that were available for a child with her rare genetic condition that would need a liver transplant in the next couple of years. And that was when one of the social workers first shared with us about the Children's Organ Transplant Association. And I would just encourage anybody who's listening to this, you may think that, hey, we've got great jobs, good insurance, a good support system, maybe a church or community of faith surrounding us, family, friends, neighbors that are willing to help us on this journey. But like you just said, Rick, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't understand how the trips to the hospital and the food and the gas and the supplies and the medicines and everything starts to add up on the transplant journey. And I still remember the afternoon that my wife and I were at the hospital and we were meeting with various different departments in preparation for transplant, that we were like, I feel like we're doing okay right now, but we didn't know what we didn't know, like you said. And I still remember that conversation where we were like, we should just call the Children's Organ Transplant Association and see what they might be able to do for us. And it was one of the best calls that we made in a preparation for Micah's transplant. So thank you guys for what you do, because now looking at her transplant 7 years out and her life 9 years out, I truly know that it wouldn't be the same without great organizations and partners around us. So thank you.
Well, and Richie, I think that's a really critical point, because you just mentioned 7 years post-transplant, and that's not something that most of our parents are thinking about. They're literally thinking about, how do I get my child to transplant, and then how do we get them home again? And they're not thinking about 5 years from now or 7 years from now, or in Ben's case, 31 years later. What are all those things that we're going to have to cobble together, all those days that you have to miss for clinic visits, for lab draws? It's not just the expense, but it's the time that's invested there. And having someone to come alongside you, whether it's COTA or your church or whomever, it really is something that makes a tremendous impact when you think about it's years and not just days or weeks.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we live in an instantaneous society that, wants everything now. And I think that many times, and I'm tempted to view life this way on a daily basis, that we want everything in the microwave, not the crock pot. And when you think of the transplant journey, like we describe to families all the time, that it is a journey and it's a roller coaster. There's lots of ups and downs. And I don't know who said it, but the only way that you get hurt on a roller coaster is if you jump off, and that's where the don't quit, persevere mentality comes from, of just like, you got to ride these waves. But you need people, individuals, and organizations that can come alongside of you to help you do that. And what a better guide than an organization that's been doing it for several decades. I'll pause right here and just remind our listeners that the purpose of the Pressing On podcast is to amplify voices of perseverance and highlight the journey of hospitalized families, so that everyone who listens will be encouraged to press on through tough times holistically. Again, a reminder that our podcast is sponsored by the Children's Organ Transplant Association, and we have the privilege of having their president and CEO, Rick Lofgren, with us today. COTA is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so funds raised to help meet transplant expenses are not considered income for families. COTA's services and guidance are provided at no charge to transplant families, and 100% of each contribution made to COTA in honor of patients helps meet transplant-related expenses, and gifts to COTA are fully tax deductible. So for more information on how COTA might financially assist your family on the transplant journey, head to COTA.org. That's COTA.org. Again, we're visiting with my friend and the president and CEO of the Children's Organ Transplant Association, Rick Lofgren. Rick, a large portion of your responsibility is fundraising and developing relationships in order to meet the financial needs for not only COTA's administrative processes, but also for transplant families nationwide. Regarding your fundraising efforts to help support COTA's mission, what are some of the biggest obstacles to fundraising and challenges that you've experienced for raising capital?
I think everyone's been involved in fundraising at some point in their lives, whether it's a parent who's part of the PTO or PTA at their kid's school, whether it's part of their church community, their faith community, where they do fundraising for activities, for missions trips, for youth groups, those kind of things. And many of us with our kids in school, we've probably gone door to door to sell things for Little League or softball or soccer. So we all have that experience that we know what we do. When I was in high school, I remember selling wrapping paper and lotion soap. But those are the kind of things that everyone just understands.
It's Girl Scout cookie season right now, so everybody's got tagalongs and Thin Mints on the brain.
That's it. I remember when that used to be $2 a box, and I know it's not that any longer.
It's $6 now.
yeah, inflation. Well, I think everyone has a good idea of what fundraising means to them, but from a big picture standpoint, for what we do, it's not just those one-off things that are, the $6 box sales, the wrapping paper at $25. it's a whole lot more than that. So it might be a golf outing. It could be a gala. We have fundraising activities, and we have step-by-step instructions that allow families to do that. And when I say families, I don't necessarily mean like whenever we do fundraising, we try to get mom and dad to step back and focus on their child like you did with Micah. But we want to work with a volunteer team that can come alongside your family, kind of give you a gentle nudge to move out of the way and to focus on the healthcare needs of your child, but work with COTA in the volunteer team. And I know your sister was one of the key volunteers in doing that, Richie.
Mm-hmm.
We really want to leverage the connections that those folks have that are in your community that have said, I want to help. Please let us know what we can do. And we can give them the step-by-step instructions to make them successful, whether it's one of those events we talked about or a Facebook fundraiser or just doing some online fundraising using the donation pages that we provide.
Mm-hmm.
It really takes someone that is organized and able to do that, that really loves your family. And in particular, they're ready to move forward because they know who those people are in their community that can make an impact. And that's where working with a nonprofit helps because, for instance, if you work for a matching gift employer, gifts that you make to a COTA campaign can be matched because we're a 501c3. Or if you do something at a local Chick-fil-A, the Chick-fil-A owner knows that COTA is a reputable organization. They can work with us and they know that the money's going to be used where it's supposed to be. Organizations like the American Legion family, there are more than 13,000 posts across the country. COTA is one of their preferred charities. And so if you're working with us, we can help those families with making connections. And I can't tell you the number of pancake breakfasts, Friday night fish fries, bingo games, all those activities that go on in a Legion Post week in and week out. We can show families how to connect with people in their communities to make that beneficial for their transplant kids. So those are the kind of things that you have to come up with those ideas as an individual working with an organization like COTA. We already have that in place and we have those relationships so that we can help make that easier.
Well, and speaking from the perspective of, like a transplant dad that's preparing for their child to, have surgery and receive the transplant in the coming months and years, I remember thinking at the time when we just thought of fundraising and everything that you just described, I remember thinking, I definitely don't have time for one more thing right now. And it's so refreshing. I remember when 5 or 6 people were getting together at the local Panera Bread with the COTA rep that came out from Bloomington, to sit down and talk about Micah Joy's prospective, liver transplant and how they were going to kind of band together as a group. And I didn't have to attend that meeting, even as her dad. And so like, it was such a refreshing process for me because I was like, wow, like COTA is organizing this with some of our family members, some of our lead volunteers, some people that care about our family so that mom and dad can stay present to the situation at hand and still continue to advocate for our daughter. So I feel that deeply because we've experienced what COTA brings to the transplant process. I definitely knew that I didn't have one more ounce of energy to give to something else, even if it was as valuable as fundraising. So what a great process because I want to speak that out there for maybe the mom or dad who's considering, well, I just don't have time for one more thing right now, that the COTA process is very doable for fundraising by tapping into your circle of influence and your network and loved ones and family members that care about your child.
No. Thank you for saying that, Richie, because I'll be honest, that is a conversation I have with every one of our families. And I have told a lot of dads that you need to step back and let us help. And there have been occasions where the mama bear in our moms comes out and they just want to protect it. I completely understand. I would do the exact same thing. But if you take a step back and say, if that were my next door neighbor, how hard would it be for me to immediately say, what can I do to help? And that's what your friends and family want to do to help you. And you're actually helping them by giving them the opportunity to come alongside you and make that impact. And like you said, Richie, there are just so many things that you can't anticipate as a transplant parent until you're doing that. And at that point, it's awfully hard to say, well, I've got to go to work today and I've got a clinic visit tomorrow and I've got to do all these things for the other kids' activities. Something has to give. And if you can have volunteers that help come and work with COTA or one of the other organizations that do this, it just makes a lot easier for your family to get through this process. It's not going to be easy, but it will be easier than it would be if you tried to go alone.
Right, right. You mentioned several different ideas of it. Fundraising could look like a golf outing or a pancake breakfast or a gala. But what are some new and creative ways that you've seen transplant families successfully raise capital through COTA here over the last couple of years?
Well, it's funny. Prior to the pandemic, we had all kinds of online and virtual activities that no one cared about and wanted anything to do with just because you didn't need it. Then the pandemic happened, and all of a sudden, all those activities were very easily implemented and utilized. And what we've discovered since the pandemic has ended is that we've been able to blend successfully a live event and a virtual event. So the hybrid model works even better. So,
Hmm.
as an example, as a runner, Richie, you probably participated in multiple 10Ks or half marathon events. A lot of those are set up as fundraisers. And oftentimes, if you have something like at your kid's school, it's at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning or 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, you might have a conflict at that time. And if you can't participate, that you just walk away.
Right.
Putting together a virtual component of that, you could have someone run that virtual 10K at any time and still participate in the fundraiser.
Hmm.
And so we've been able to kind of stretch the resources of all of our activities so that while there still is that live event where you try to get a critical mass of people together, there are also those people that can't make it there and they can do it on their own. And it could be that it's not just they couldn't make it there at that day, that maybe they live a state or two or 10 away from you and they can participate remotely from San Diego rather than from in Pittsburgh. So there are a lot of ways that we've been able to really tie successful fundraising activities and put a virtual component to them so that they are much more successful. And that just enlarges the pool of people that are helping, which ends up having a greater outcome in terms of the fundraising. And it's not just to raise more money, it's to get more people involved, more people engaged, whether they're volunteers, donors, or just participants in the activities. We want to get as many people involved because the more people that know about what's going on, the more they're going to talk about it, and the more people that they're going to influence to help as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's important for families to understand as we're talking about fundraising here that, like you said earlier, it's not just a 25, 50, $100, price tag here that, a lot of these campaigns are looking to raise 50, 60, $70,000 for the transplant related expenses. And, I can share this because it's my personal experience, but in the 2017 year that Micah received her transplant and was hospitalized 4 or 5 different times because of different side effects and obstacles and rejection and the like. I remember our explanation of benefits through insurance was over $2 million just for the year 2017. And without, state funding and good insurance and, having, to be able to draw upon the COTA fund that so many had volunteered for, like I literally as a father don't know what we would have done. But kind of like as the theme that you shared earlier, you don't know what you don't know. The financial side of a transplant is one of those things that you don't know until it's there. And I know that Micah's experience might have been on the more expensive end of a lot of these things, but it was definitely shocking to me to read that and just considered it a huge blessing that financial burden had been taken care of. Because of all that she went through. So I just share that from personal experience for our listeners that this isn't, well, maybe we'll raise 5 or 10 grand and that'll just cover everything for the whole year. These things can get very, very pricey, very, very quick, even with great healthcare and great insurance. So,
Well, I always tell people, Richie, my wife had both knees replaced a couple of years ago,
mhm.
and each instance was a set amount of money, but our out of pocket cost for Lisa's surgery was $3,500. I know that was my cost for the year in which she had those two surgeries. Transplant families, if you have a $3,500 out of pocket cost, that's going to be $3,500 this year and next year and every year to follow.
Mhm.
My wife's knees are doing great, and it cost us $3,500. Micah's transplant, she's doing great, and it cost $2 million.
Right.
That's a significant difference. And transplant is just so much deeper in cost and time commitment than most people can understand when they start it. So having someone come alongside you to do that again, it just is an incredible benefit because it is not a one-time expense. It is a lifetime.
Hmm. I think that I know where you're probably going to go with this next question that I have because you talked a little bit about, the engagement of loved ones and volunteers that surround you during the fundraising process. But for the families that have successfully met their goals, for raising funds, for COTA in honor of their child that's pursuing a transplant, what have been some of the common themes of success that those groups of folks and families have had as they've raised funds through COTA?
Well, I think probably the best way to characterize this is you need someone to lead the effort that is organized. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need someone that's a type A personality that's just hard driving, is going to keep pushing, but you do need someone that is going to stick to it. And
Mm-hmm.
so you may recall from the Far Side cartoons, there was one that was specifically about organizing a posse, and it's a group of horses and cowboys just in a big pile in front of the sheriff. And the sheriff says you have to really work at organize a posse. You can't just throw it together. And that's kind of what fundraising is. It's not just here are a bunch of ideas, let's throw it out, see who volunteers to help. You need someone to ride herd over that group to say, okay, I need you to do this. I need you to talk to these businesses. I need you to get to this church to see if we can use their fellowship hall. There are
Mm-hmm.
things like that that the organization really makes a tremendous impact. So as you're looking forward to doing fundraising or doing any kind of activity, if it's just awareness, we have a lot of families that fundraising is part of what they're doing, but they're also trying to find, for instance, a kidney donor.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're doing a drive to try to find someone that will make an altruistic kidney donation. So having that group of people that will come alongside you and focus on what are the goals, allow again mom and dad to go off to the side and focus on their child, but have that group keep moving forward. I can't tell you the number of times we've had a campaign training session, and I'm thinking of a family from Erie, Pennsylvania that this happened to.
Hmm.
The day that they were at the training session, they got the call for the heart transplant.
Oh, wow.
And I wish I could say we caused that. I can't go quite that far, but it's just ironic that that group was getting together, and the feeling of energy and enthusiasm in that room was just incredible.
Mm.
But that's the kind of thing that if you have that energy, enthusiasm coupled with an organized group of people that want to help, you can go a long way to make sure that happens. And that volunteer team raised close to $150,000.
Wow.
And Lindsay had a very successful heart transplant and now is a mom of her own,
Mm.
just 22 or 23 years post-transplant, but doing really well.
Wow, that's awesome. No, thanks for sharing that specific story. That kind of gives me goosebumps just thinking about, every transplant family can tell the story about the call, and for many families, when there's false alarms, the multiple calls. But wow, that's a surreal feeling to be with people that are championing you and your child and the transplant process. Wow. Wow. I want to pause for just a second. And while COTA comes alongside of families to support them for a lifetime with fundraising and finances, here at Pressing On, we believe in meeting tangible needs in order to meet intangible needs. And we have various programs that help resource hospitalized families physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Here's just a few of them: our hospital care package program, our gas card program, transplant backpack program that we've partnered with COTA with to supply to transplant families throughout the nation, our crisis coaching program, and Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh program. So if you or a family that you know is affected by a long-term hospitalization or on the journey of pediatric transplant, we'd love to come alongside of you physically, emotionally, and spiritually with Pressing On free resources at this time. So let me encourage you to visit our website at pressingon.org to sign up for our free resources or to make a referral. That's pressingon.org for more information. We're talking today with the CEO and president of the Children's Organ Transplant Association, shortened to COTA, my good friend Rick Lofgren. Rick, thanks again for joining us today and sharing a little bit behind the scenes. I want to get behind the curtain of Rick Lofgren, the leader and the man right now, because I think our listeners would enjoy this story. There's something that you have done that maybe not a lot of people know about. A lot of people, when they ascend to leadership as the CEO or president of an organization, many times, unfortunately, I think that they feel like they're above the fray and they just simply are going to make leadership, decisions, make sure that the company's always doing well with finances and kind of stay above the day-to-day workings of the organization. But I know for a fact that that's not you. I remember early on when we pursued transplant that my wife Regan got a phone call directly from you. And I remember at first she was very confused that she was like, this isn't like a staff member at COTA. This is like the CEO and president of Children's Organ Transplant Association, that you were just simply calling to check in, touch base, and make a personal connection. I'm curious how you developed such a relational style of leadership, because making those individual phone calls to every transplant family, over 4,000 families, that's not something you had to do. But why is that important to you?
Well, I think, Richie, the fact that transplant has touched my family, and knowing what my aunt and uncle went through and my cousins that were dealing with this, I think it's one of those cases where you want to be large enough that you know your organization can make an impact, but you want to be small enough where you can have that hands-on approach. So I feel very strongly that way back when I started 25 years ago, I was employee number 4. So it was a lot easier when we helped 31 families that first year that I was at COTA. This last year, we helped 255 families. And I think that's the kind of thing that I want to keep as the guiding principle of what we do, is that it's personal, and we're here with you. Every one of our families is important. Everyone has, as you said, a different story and a different path ahead of them. But the general theme is we need to do this together. And so we want to set from the very onset of the campaigns, this is where we're going to be. This is how we're going to help you. And you need to, again, lean on the people around that offer to help. And that's what we do. But I think that's important for any leader, to make sure that the people that they're working with, whether that's colleagues and staff members, or in our case, our patient families are our customers. And I don't think of them as customers. I think of them as family. But those are the kind of things that we want every one of our team members to feel like this is who I'm helping. It's not that call at 4:55 as you're about to go home on a Friday afternoon that keeps you there in the office. It's that call from a family that's in crisis. And right now, the most important thing in minds is what's in front of them, and we need to make sure that we help solve that problem. So I hope that our team does that, and does that for every family that we work with. And I want to make sure that that's the way we operate the organization at every level.
No, that's admirable. It definitely makes a difference. So you were employee number 4, huh?
When I was hired, we had just had a little bit of a downsizing. This is going to be a funny story, Richie, that I won't go into a lot of detail. But the way COTA did most fundraising early on for operations, operating the business as opposed to operating local campaigns like yours, we had the largest bingo game in the state of Indiana. So we raised a tremendous amount of money through bingo. The state of Indiana made it difficult to do that and do it legally. And so when I was hired, I closed the bingo operation and went to a more traditional model of fundraising. And so we picked that back up. So at that time, we shrunk a little bit, only to reposition ourselves to do a much better job. And the past 25 years have proven that was the right decision, as we've gone from 31 families to 255. And that's new families every year. So not only are we helping those families in that year, but all those years leading up to that point.
Yeah. So if you were employee number 4 when you started in 1998, I believe, how many employees does COTA have right now?
We have 23 employees, and we have people that do everything from marketing our services to transplant center teams. We have people that make sure that our families' needs are met. So any of your listeners that call our office, our family services team would make sure that your needs are taken care of. We have people that make sure that the lights are on and they can run those kind of things. And we have staff members that their main responsibility is to go out to hospitals and to market our services to transplant social workers and financial coordinators. You mentioned earlier in the podcast, the social worker that you work with at Children's. John was a good friend for many years, and I know he's since moved on to another opportunity. But we've surveyed our families, and we found that about 80% of COTA moms and dads have said the social worker was that key person at the hospital that influenced them.
Yeah.
They probably do a podcast like this one for Pressing On. Maybe they attended a conference. Perhaps when they went through the clinic visit, a nurse told them about COTA. But the key person to make a decision was their social worker.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I know that was our story as well, that, you're all ears because it's a brand new journey and you're just trying to soak up as much information and insight and wisdom as you can from some of these folks that have seen other families go through the journey. And I'm so glad that we made the call to COTA many, many years ago. I have a few final questions that I'd like to ask you as far as like specific advice to transplant parents, different things that maybe you would consider a good book or article or resource, for families. But at the end of the podcast, I always love to do this thing that, for lack of a better term, I just have been calling our rapid fire round. So just to humanize our guests a little bit, I'd love to ask you just a few short questions just to get to know you just a little bit deeper, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Fire away.
So there's I think I've got four of them here, but first one is your favorite place to vacation or get away that you and Lisa have enjoyed.
I have two. My first one is in the summertime, and that is St. Joseph, Michigan, right along the coast of Lake Michigan. Great place to bike and kayak and to be out on the lake. And the second one is more cold weather for those of us that live in the northern hemisphere. I love Isla Mirada, Florida, and the Florida Keys. It is always 75, 80 degrees there, and anytime we go down, it is just a wonderful getaway.
So here's second question. Favorite thing that you like to eat for breakfast?
Well, I have a dairy allergy, so the joke in our house is our oldest grandson, whenever he comes over, he says, "Step one, no milk." So I love toast with peanut butter and Nutella. So if anyone has not tried Nutella, it is a definite go-to for me.
Okay. All right. Third question. Favorite sports team?
My dad is from Pittsburgh, so I grew up as a Steelers and Pirates fan. So anytime there's a game on, even though I live in Indianapolis, I do cheer for the Colts when they're playing, unless they're playing the Steelers. Been a long-time Steeler fan, and I had the wonderful joy about 13 years ago. I sat in the green room at Fox Sports and talked football with Terry Bradshaw, Michael Strahan, Jimmy Johnson. It was just incredible. But I asked Terry Bradshaw questions that when I went back and told my dad, his mouth dropped to the floor. It was just incredible. So Steelers all.
I love that. We still have to take in a game here in Pittsburgh together, but yeah, I had a selfish reason for asking those questions because I think I knew the answers where they were coming from. But we, as the readers, we love our Pittsburgh sports, that's for sure. Last rapid fire round question. Favorite movie of all time?
I'm going to choose a miniseries, Band of Brothers. It was written by one of my favorite authors, Stephen Ambrose. I've read all of the books that he's written on World War II. I think there are so many things that are very applicable to transplant. It is people working together with a common goal and people that stick together many years afterwards. If you've not seen it, I won't give away the whole storyline, but it's about World War II and a group of men that went literally from basic training to Normandy, fought during the Battle of the Bulge, and then their lives after that. It is one of those stories that I've seen, literally seen dozens of times, and it moves me every single time. My son-in-law is currently in the Navy and currently deployed, and it reminds me every time of what those guys went through and what he's dealing with today. So I think there's transferable commonalities there between the movie and transplant. So if your listeners haven't seen it yet, Band of Brothers is it.
Oh, I love that. I have watched that through a few times and completely agree 100% with everything you just shared. Let me just take a moment here before we close with a few final questions for our friend Rick Lofgren to take a moment to remind you that you can follow along with all things Pressing On various social media platforms. So to stay up to date with our journey to uplift hospitalized families and those on the transplant journey, follow along on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Just search for Pressing On PGH on most platforms. Again, we're visiting with the CEO and president of the Children's Organ Transplant Association, Rick Lofgren. Rick, thanks for being with us today and sharing so many insights about your life, your leadership, and what the Children's Organ Transplant Association does behind the scenes with fundraising for transplant families. A few remaining questions, and one that I think is especially important to our listeners that are on the transplant journey. But what specific advice would you give to transplant parents as they navigate the tough times before, during, and after transplant?
I think one of the things that we've talked about earlier is lean on those other people around you that want to help. But the one thing we've not spent a lot of time is lean on those transplant professionals that have been there and done that as well. We mentioned a moment ago your social worker at Children's of Pittsburgh. John was one of those people that not only did he know where all the resources were that families needed to know about that you just couldn't know until
Mm-hmm.
you had to have them, but he could point you in directions that would make an impact. And I think that includes organizations like Pressing On. I'm sure that many of your listeners have been part of other charities that they work with, but there are a lot of incredible charities in the transplant world that really do deal with specific things. So
Mm-hmm.
everyone I'm sure is familiar with UNOS, the National Kidney Foundation. They're kind of the big organizations, but I'm talking more about those organizations like Pressing On, like COTA, like Transplant Families that are really dealing with the things that impact families on a day-to-day basis. And I know you and
Mm-hmm.
Reagan did a presentation for the Transplant Families event a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I think it's great that we help each other. I don't think we're in any way competitors. I think we complement each other. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that I want your listeners to get away, come away from this and get as a key component. There's not one thing that each of us does that's in isolation. It all comes together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think having resources at your fingertips that you can say, I need to know this because I'm inpatient right now. Richie and Reagan have this resource to help me. I know
Mm-hmm.
that there are things that are further down the road that I don't know what's coming yet, but there's another organization that can help. And I know that this is all going to cost a lot of money and a lot of time. And that's where COTA can come alongside and help. So I
Mm-hmm.
think using the organizations that are out there and you're not having to recreate the wheel, you're using their knowledge and leveraging their experience to help your family. And that's what
Yeah.
we all hope we're doing is making an impact.
No, that's a really great point because I think that in the marketplace and in the business world, everybody's concerned about market share and that it's a zero sum game that in order to grow, you got to take something from someone else. And I know kind of dipping our toes in the nonprofit world and specifically serving hospitalized families and transplant families over the last couple of years here through Pressing On, I've been blown away by the generosity and humility and collaboration of all of the organizations that we've run into that are now partners. And so thank you guys for being a partner and championing what we do with Pressing On. Like you said, I view it as a collaboration, and I think that our families that we serve feel that deeply as well. So that's definitely a good word. Is there a specific book or article or podcast or resource or any go-tos that you or anybody on the COTA team find yourself referring to families like, oh, maybe you should check this out? Maybe our listeners might be interested if there's any specific advice that you have regarding that.
Yeah, I can't point to a single book because it is a very fractured in that regard, but I can tell you there are great podcasts out there. When I go to my office, Richie, it's a 45-minute drive. So I can listen to a podcast on the way to work and on the way home. So I
Mm-hmm.
listen to Pressing On's podcast. If your families are liver only families, Bear Inc. has a great podcast. Um, Transplant Families has a podcast for your CF patients. The Bunnell Foundation has a fantastic podcast just for CF patients. I think there's a lot of information that's out there that is available at no cost to families that we just need to take advantage of. And depending on what your need is, whether that's fundraising, emotional support, what are those resources that are available for this specific disease, those exist. And I'm amazed. I will give away my age here just a little bit, but since Google has been around, you can find just about everything. And I
Mm-hmm.
encourage your families to go out there, do a Google search, find what you're looking for specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm confident if you're doing a transplant, you're going to hear Pressing On or see Pressing On as one of those options that comes to
Mm-hmm.
the top. But there are a lot of resources out there that can make this a lot easier for families because someone else has already gone that path and lived that journey before you,
Mm-hmm.
and listen to what they have to say and some of the advice that they have to give.
Yeah. Well, here as we close, I just want to say thank you. Not just from a professional standpoint in how our organizations partner with one another, but thank you also as a personal friend and mentor of mine for the ways that you've, instilled in me and impressing on, you know, uh, just a diligence and responsibility and humility. Like as we've gotten started, like I feel like in a few short years, we've been able to learn a lot from you and from the way that COTA operates. I always like to tell our guests, towards the end, just a simple affirmation. I think what I heard from you today is that relational leadership is the way to go about things, not a top-down hierarchy. And that fundraising doesn't have to be old and bland. It can be creative. It doesn't need to be boring. It can be outside the box. But I think one of the biggest things that I think will be left with me after our conversation today is the engagement of loved ones and volunteers and the collaboration that it takes. Because one of the things that we say at Pressing On all the time to the families that we serve is that you're not alone. And that means many different things. But I think in our society, we're tempted to go alone, or that no one else has experienced the pain or trauma or the things that we feel in our lives. And so, like, your relational leadership and the collaboration and the collaborative ways that COTA works with volunteers, that's definitely something that's going to stick with me. So I just want to affirm who you are as a man and as a leader in the organization, the Children's Organ Transplant Association. From Pressing On standpoint, professionally, but also personally, we're very thankful for you guys.
Well, that's very kind of you. That means a lot to me. Thank you, Richie.
In closing, what's the easiest way to follow you and COTA online and social media these days for our listeners?
The best way to do that is to go to our website at cota.org. That's COTA.org. And all of our social media links are there. We do have Instagram. We have a pretty significant video library on Vimeo. And we do a lot of work on LinkedIn. But if you go to cota.org, that's a good jumping off point to go there. And we do have our partners highlighted there. So Pressing On is one of those partners that we highlight on our website. And your listeners will be able to get some good information about other organizations there as well.
Well, that's wonderful. We want to say thanks for joining us today, Rick, on the Pressing On podcast. We really appreciate your insight and advice.
Thank you for having me, and have a great day.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, know that you're not alone, and let us encourage you to keep pressing on. Have a great day.